friends of the Kreisky Forum. I want to say hello and a warm welcome to everybody of you here in the Kreisky Forum on this wonderful evening in Vienna. And a special welcome to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who joins us for this evening here in the Kreisky Forum. Jeffrey Sachs, we are glad to have you here. Jeffrey Sachs is professor at the Columbia University and director of the Oesch Institute there. He is special advisor to the UN General Secretary, but he has also a very long academic career between the years in Harvard to the years in Columbia. Starting in Harvard as one of the youngest professors in the economic field. I think you were 28 years old as you became professor of economics in Harvard, with stops at a lot of universities and academic hotspots. And he's also known for a couple of important books, End of Poverty, Commonwealth, and a lot of more. He was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential persons on a global scale, 2 times, I think, in 2004 and 2005. And interestingly, there is also a long way, in a way, between the Jeffrey Sachs became well known in the end of the 80s, where he became to global fame as advisor to governments in Poland, in Estonia, in Slovenia, before also as advisor to governments in Latin America, where he was best known as an advocate of a fast pro-market privatization strategy. And on the other hand, in a way, maybe there's a change, maybe not, we will hear, to the contemporary Jeffrey Sachs, thinking about global economic justice on a global scale and also about economic justice within Western societies. And especially the last question, in a way, is a very contemporary question. After Brexit, after the Trump shock, we are all still in the Trump shock. I think in autumn, I read a piece of Jeffrey Sachs, The Truth About Trade, which was very impressive because he, at that point, said, we talk about the advantages we all get by trade, but we have to discuss about the losers and the winners. And if we don't do that, the losers will revolt. And we see, in a way, the perverse results of this revolt. And I'm sure we will hear today, under the title, The Revolt Against Globalization, a lot about that. And we are very interested. And Jeffrey Sachs, again, we are glad to have you here, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Robert, and thank you for having me here, and thank you for being here for a discussion. I'm really going to try not to talk too long so that we can have an open discussion, because there are so many interesting questions right now, and I would enjoy hearing what's on your mind and what's on your mind about what's on my mind also. But I'll conventionally give a lecture first, but not a long one, I promise. And if it gets too long, someone stand up and say, stop, because we need time for discussion. I'm really thrilled to be in the Bruno Kreisky Foundation because, of course, I remember Bruno Kreisky from my very young days of being even the beginning of political awareness. I don't think I understood much or knew much at the time, but of course he was a very, very great man and a leader of my main theme and my main hope, and that's social democracy. The concept of a decent society where we use our collective will to make for collective betterment is, in one sense, obvious and straightforward, and on the other side, almost impossible to achieve. And so when someone like Kreisky is a leader at a national and a global level for decades and really achieving, it's a notable accomplishment in a historic scale. And so for me, it's a lot of fun also to be here to enjoy that atmosphere. And you'll see at least one picture of President Kennedy in my brief remarks, because I love President Kennedy and what he stood for. And so I was so happy to see photographs of President Kennedy and Foreign Minister Kreisky at the time in the library next door. That's very also exciting for me. We're living in a very strange time. Thank you for doing well on your second round election, which was really important and a great relief. I had hoped you would teach us a lesson. My country's stranger than your country, and we have really one of the weirdest presidents that we've ever had. That's partly because my imagination doesn't really go back to James Buchanan or Andrew Jackson, who was also a pretty nasty man, actually. But we've got really a piece of work right now. And we're going to need to figure out what this means. How does someone like Donald Trump become president? At a certain level, it's obvious, because that's what politics is showmanship to an important extent in the age of mass media. It sometimes produces horrors. Donald Trump in his, quote, normal life, if you could call it that, was 11 years a TV star in the United States. What better qualification for president could there be? And so that's one simple answer. But I want to talk more about the sociology of what makes it possible for a vote for Trump or for Brexit, or nearly for Hofer in your case, or Le Pen, or the fact that we have some pretty Wilders in the Netherlands. What could be more normal than the Netherlands? And the fact that we had to have anxiety about that for months shows how unusual it is. But they did very much the right thing. So that was a kind of consolation. But there obviously are important dynamics at play right now. And they're very frightening dynamics, because one thing we know from history, the history of this country, to be sure, is that unfortunately horrible things can happen. And we need to understand as carefully as we can what is happening, because trends are not good, and we're not in a safe time right now. And also, one of the very perverse aspects of our time is the casualness that the word war is thrown around. But war between China and the US, why not? Hey, why not? War in the Middle East, and so forth. That's a reality that's nonstop. And this is extremely dangerous. And it's also part of the story right now of globalization. So I want to share some thoughts with you about that. I think we are seeing in my country, in the United States, and in a lot of Europe, of course, differences in the political dynamics, but there are two major axes of the populism and the anti-globalization that we're seeing on the populist right now. And one of them is a class phenomenon. It is related to how our economies are working or failing to work adequately. And one is clearly a cultural ethnicity phenomenon, really related to the polarization by race, religion, native versus foreign-born, migrants versus natives, and so forth. These are distinct. They intersect, but they are two different phenomena. In the United States, both are very much at play right now. We have an economic dimension of populism, and Donald Trump played very skillfully, almost with complete lies, by the way, almost not a word of truth from the moment that he appeared till today. But he played on the economic pain that a lot of America is feeling. And he absolutely played, of course, on the ethnic issues, basically by sneering and calling Mexicans rapists and Muslims terrorists and everything that he could do to inflame society and capture his white base. So both of these dynamics are at play, and it's worth us understanding them. Class seemed to be going away 50 years ago in the high-income world, and it's back. And I think that this is a bit of a disappointment, because there are very few places in the world. Austria is relatively one of them, Scandinavia certainly, that has continued to have essentially a social market or a social democratic approach. The United States definitely does not. And the important point about class in the modern economy is that the market forces are definitely contributing to a widening of income inequalities. And so the basic point of politics in the high-income world is that if you leave things alone, inequality will widen under the tensions that we're experiencing. So you need an active engagement of government and other institutions on the side of keeping the income inequalities narrow. And in the United States, we stopped doing that already almost 40 years ago. Basically, I can tell you we stopped doing it at 10 a.m. January 20th, 1981, when Ronald Reagan became president, because that was the moment ideologically when we said we don't have to use government for the purpose of resisting market forces. We need government to put wind in the sails of whatever the market is doing. We need to amplify, not push against market forces. And since that time, we've had a dramatic widening of income inequality. And we have recreated not only a base of poor, which America always had with its African American population, but a real underclass of white Americans, which existed in history but was disappearing in the 60s and the 70s, and was recreated from the 1980s onward almost as a political creation. But it's a set of market forces that did this unresisted by public policy. And those market forces I list here as contributing to that. I think there are four that we should keep in mind. One, and the most important, is technological change has continued to favor those with skill, and indeed you need more and more skill to keep ahead of the machines. And we're going to lose that battle, by the way. The machines are going to be better than all of us soon. And instead of me, there will be a robot, and instead of all of you, there will be robots. They will talk to each other. We'll go out and have a cup of coffee, but we won't give lectures to each other. For that, the robots will be doing the work. So skill-based technical change has been a major part of our already widening income inequalities, and I'll show you a little bit of evidence about that in a moment. Trade has worked the same way, because when rich countries like ours open up to trade with poorer countries like China, the underlying economics is absolutely obvious that higher skilled, intensive industries will export to China, and China will export goods that are intensive in wage labor, which is 1/10 or 1/20th the cost per hour. And that's exactly what happened. And if you open up the market for capital movements in the form of factories with global production chains, they will relocate their labor-intensive processes abroad, in the US case to Mexico or to China, and that will mean also a fall of demand for workers of lower skills that used to work in factories and now can't find jobs. And we heard a very vivid example of this a couple of days ago when a friend of ours was describing somebody coming into a Starbucks to submit an application for a job as a barista in a New York Starbucks, and they looked at the application and said, "Do you have a college degree?" And the answer was no. "Oh, we're only hiring with college degree." Can you imagine if you can't even get a barista job as a high school graduate, what's happening to the demand for labor at the lower end of the income distribution? Immigration is a third factor. Most of us in professional lives view the question of immigration through a moral or a political dimension, that it's the right thing to do. But in an economic sense, it is competition for lower skilled workers. And if you're already being hit by technology and by offshoring of jobs, I'm sure it's a real political phenomenon in a way that may sound racist and obnoxious, but is actually pretty straightforward pocketbook economics. And that's another, it, by the way, may also be racist or xenophobic or other things, but it's also economic. And it's another factor because most of the migrants, whether it's the refugees from Syria and Afghanistan in Europe, or whether it's Hispanic migration in the United States, which has been our dominant migration. This is relatively lower skilled workers, and that means competition for lower skilled native workers, and that's another amplifier of the income gap. And the fourth area that I would say is the phenomenon of sorting. With more mobility, we've seen in the United States at least that the rich are tending more to live with the rich, the poor more with the poor. And statistically, within our cities and across the country, there's more residential sorting. You want to live, if you can afford it, if you're affluent, you want to live definitely in an affluent place because the schools are better. Of course, the environmental amenities are better as well. Rents are high, and the sorting is on an economic basis as well as a cultural and class basis. But this also means that the normal spillovers from a working class person living in a city next door to a wealthy person is a objectively less frequent phenomenon in U.S. economic geography than it used to be. So a lot of the spillovers that were socially, culturally, and economically equalizing, I think, have diminished in force. So all of these trends, to my mind, have been market forces that have amplified inequality. And they show up in some rather unusual ways. This is a graph. I don't know if people on this side can see it. It's a curve that goes like that. So it's level for a while, and then it goes down. And that curve is the labor share of value in national income. It measures wage compensation as a share of national income. And when I was training in economics a few centuries ago, that was taken to be a constant. And what we see instead is that the labor share of value is declining. I have an idea that it's declining much faster than even the conventional data show, because some of what is called the return to labor is really the return to what economists call human capital, which means that you've invested heavily in advanced skills,